Elizabeth Chur is a swing left San Francisco volunteer and freelance medical writer who has talked with more than 1,000 volunteers on the phone and in person. In the 2022 midterms, she spent a month in the Bakersfield area, canvassing and ballot curing full time. She has trained more than 2,500 volunteers nationally through 3 acclaimed workshops: phone bank and canvassing training for introverts, Spanish for activists, and You and the 34%, how to have meaningful conversations with high potential voters. Elizabeth has compiled her most helpful tips and strategies in her new book, just published last month. It's called The Joy of Talking Politics with Strangers: How to Save Democracy One Conversation at a Time. And it's available in paperback and as an ebook on Amazon, bookshop.org, and many other platforms. And we will drop a link in the chat with more information. ElizabethChur.com is where you can go if you want to get more information on her. And I'm sure she will have other alternate sources where you can find her great stuff. So without further ado, Elizabeth, if you want to take the mic.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabe. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Wow, what a great turnout. So happy to be here 3 weeks before Election Day. I would just love to know, I guess, how many of you, I guess I can't see most of you, but how many of you have written letters or postcards this cycle? I understand. Yes. Okay. A lot of folks. Okay. Wow. A lot of postcards. All right. Thank you. You can put your hands down. How many of you have ever phone banked before? If you could just put your hands up, it'd be great to know. Okay. We've got quite a few phone bankers. And then how about if you could put your hands down, please, and just raise your hand if you've never done phone banking before, maybe just once or twice, just so I get a sense of, okay, all right, quite a few folks that are newer to phone banking. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I hope that whatever your level of experience, that you'll find something useful in this presentation. And before I get into the details, I just want to say, if you're newer to talking directly with voters, or you're trying it actually for the first time, I want to thank you for your courage and your willingness to step outside your comfort zone. In my experience, talking with voters has been one of the most rewarding and meaningful things I've ever done. And like most things worth doing, such as learning a new language or how to cook a new dish, I found that I get better with practice. And it can take a little time to get the hang of it, and that's normal. It's okay if you start off a little clumsy, and it's actually great that you can start phone banking today before GOTV weekend. That way you can get up to speed on how the dialer system works and how to handle the most common situations that may come up. If it's your very first time phone banking today, I recommend setting yourself an achievable goal, like just making the first phone call. That is a success. Keep in mind that if you have 1 or 2 good conversations with a voter during your shift, that is amazing. That might not seem like a lot, but a lot of these are close elections that are won or lost by 1 or 2 votes per precinct. And your contribution could make all the difference. So probably most of you have heard that phone banking is one of the best ways to increase voter turnout. As a volunteer for the Center for Common Ground, you are providing a concierge-like service for people who face a lot of obstacles to voting. You're sharing vital information about where to vote and what they might need to bring with them. And you can also help them access transportation if they need it. If it weren't for your phone call or voicemail message, they might not get this information. I know some of you may be a little nervous to call up complete strangers to talk about politics. You'll probably leave a lot of messages, which is great. Most people you actually reach will probably appreciate your time and help. But just in case you reach a few folks who might be a little more skeptical about either you or voting, I'd love to share some tips about how to make the most of those conversations also. And we will share these slides with you after the presentation. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. Before the 2016 election, I voted in every election and I phone banked every 4 years, but mostly I took democracy for granted. I assumed that other people would be taking care of that. They'd be knocking doors, making calls. I'm not sure who I thought these other people were, maybe elves, idealistic college students, but I figured they would take care of it and they'd be much better equipped. After November 2016, I realized I needed to do more. I was too scared to canvas at first, so I got my start in phone banking. And eventually, I mustered the courage to canvas in California's Central Valley and in Chesterfield County, Virginia. Yeah. So when I'm phone banking, it can be easy to get a little discouraged sometimes when I'm getting lots of disconnected numbers or voicemails and the occasional person hanging up on me. But every hour, I might have one or two conversations that make it all worthwhile. For example, in 2020, I called this young woman in Pennsylvania. I'll call Elena. She'd never voted before and she didn't know where her polling place was. I looked up her address and she said it was at a church 4 blocks away. I reminded her to bring her driver's license and asked when she thought she could vote. Elena said that she'd go to the polls first thing on election day before she went to work. She actually thanked me for calling and said she was glad I'd called. Her parents were out of town and she didn't know who else to ask. Maybe she would have figured it out on her own, but I was really glad I could give her the information she needed to vote. Life is busy and complicated for many people, and sometimes our calls can make the difference between them voting or almost voting. Also, one of the magical things about talking with voters is that you can answer their questions. Sometimes people just need to talk with someone to get the information they need. When I talked with Elena, in addition to looking up the address for her polling place, I was able to tell her what form of identification she needed to bring. And by asking her when she would go vote, we were able to talk through her plan to vote. Studies have shown that when people can make a concrete plan about when and how they're going to vote, it increases the chances that they will actually follow through. By talking with you, they get to visualize that action of voting, especially if they haven't done it before. It also helps identify and troubleshoot any obstacles, like remembering to bring their identification or lining up a ride in advance. Volunteers like you and me are like the backstage crew at a Broadway show. Think of it as Democracy, the musical. We're helping out behind the scenes so everything's ready when the actors get on stage. The voters and the local organizers in places like North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Virginia, they're the stars of this show. But it's a huge team effort. And without a full backstage crew, it's hard to put on a musical. Our friends in swing states and districts need our help to make the best use of the local staff and volunteers' precious time and to connect with the tens of thousands of voters we need to reach. Like I mentioned, most people will appreciate receiving your call and they'll feel honored that a stranger took the time to ensure they had all the information they needed to cast their ballot. But since some of you may be nervous about making these calls, let me share a few tips about how to navigate the first minute of a conversation with a voter in case they aren't so excited to hear from you. This part of the conversation can be the most challenging when a voter is most likely to hang up. The most important thing is keeping the conversation going long enough to pique their interest and earn their respect. In addition to the actual words I say, much of what I communicate is conveyed through my tone of voice. I try to channel respectful warmth from the get go. I aim for a vibe that's upbeat, friendly, and relaxed. I'll also say if you're calling to a southern state and you're from the north, it may be helpful to slow down the pace of your speech a bit to match the tempo of how people in that state talk. I like to introduce myself by saying something like, "Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Chur, and I'm not calling to ask for money. I'm a volunteer with Team Unity, North Carolina, calling to provide information about the upcoming election." In case the person who answers the phone is skeptical, here are a few things I've heard from them and what I've said to keep them talking. If they say, "Oh, I hate these calls," I can say, "Oh, I hear you. I'm a shy person and I'm uncomfortable talking with strangers. But the upcoming election is so important that I'm going out of my comfort zone to talk with people in the community to make sure they have all the information they need to vote. Some people might tell you, my vote is private. I might say, I totally respect that. I'm not calling to ask how you're voting. I just want to make sure you have everything you need to be able to vote. What if they say, oh, I don't vote? Actually, let me spend a little more time on that scenario. Amazingly, in 2020, 34% of eligible voters did not cast a ballot. That means that one-third of people who are 18 years or older and who aren't barred from voting because of a felony conviction did not vote. Of course, some of these people had their votes suppressed, and that's one reason why your calls are so important to help them overcome those barriers. But there's some portion of this 34% that chooses not to vote. What can you say in those circumstances? My approach to these kinds of conversations is inspired by the Japanese tea ceremony. I was fortunate enough to attend one of these in Japan, and there was this beautiful scroll on the wall with elegant calligraphy, and the saying roughly translated as one time, one meeting. In other words, we may only meet once in this lifetime, so let's make the most of it. I try to be present and to slow down, bring beginner's mind to each conversation. What can I learn from them? I have a whole chapter in my book called 80% Them, 20% Me. If they say, oh, I don't vote, I try to bring non judgmental curiosity to that conversation. This is not the time to tell them all the reasons I think they should vote. Instead, my goal is to find out as much as possible about their priorities, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. There are three magic phrases that help me do this, and they can be helpful in almost any conversation. The first one is, oh, interesting. Tell me more about that. Even if I disagree, I try to bring my non judgmental curiosity to the conversation. Can I view the voter like an anthropologist would? The second magic phrase is, wow, that sounds really hard. This demonstrates genuine empathy and can bring the conversation down from the head to the heart. People sometimes share about hard things that are going on in their lives that might make it less likely for them to vote. By spending just a few moments reflecting back that you really heard them, it can help build rapport and make it more likely they will open up to you. The third magic phrase is, if you could change two or three things about the country, what would they be? If they can't think of anything, I might ask it another way. What keeps you up at night? Or even, if you were in an elevator with the president for 2 minutes, what would you tell them? This helps me find out what's most important to them. The beauty of these phrases is that they're nonpartisan and they work in almost any situation with any voter. After I say any of these, I count to 10 silently in my head. Many times people feel like they have to fill that silence. If you wait for them to say something, they'll often start talking. The voter might share some interesting experiences or opinions about what they care most about, whether it's healthcare, the economy, or some other issue. You could gently note that expressing their views through their vote is one of the most important ways to help change the country for the better. I've heard people say, oh, my vote doesn't matter. A couple responses that have worked well are, if your vote doesn't matter, why do you think some people are trying to make it harder for people to vote? Another response you could try is, I like to think of voting as a down payment on a car. It's an important first step. I still need to do a lot of work to pay it off, but I need that down payment to drive the car off the lot. Voting's the same way with making our country better. What do you think about that? Just a few last suggestions for making the most of your conversations with voters. Being a good listener does not mean being silent. Conversations go a lot better when people know they have an attentive listener. When canvassing, you can show your engagement through facial expressions and body language. With phone banking, you can convey this with verbal cues like, uh huh, wow, seriously? In linguistics, this is called back channeling. The idea is that the speaker and the listener are co creating a narrative. The speaker uses the front channel and the listener uses the back channel with these kinds of cues to indicate they're engaged, interested, and they want to know more. You can also convey warmth and empathy by smiling, exaggerating your facial expressions, nodding in agreement, and talking with your hands. It may seem corny since they can't see you, but our body language and our words are bundled together as a package. If you smile, they can hear it over the phone. If appropriate, you can share a laugh with the voter, make a joke, or laugh at one of theirs. Sharing humor can very quickly create a sense of connection and bonding. These are all conversational levers and dials you can play with. Just experiment and see if any of them work for you. Also, no matter how skillfully you navigate a conversation, sometimes people will still hang up on you or they won't want to talk. It's okay. Somebody once told me if you're not hearing no at least half the time, maybe you're not asking the right questions. We're calling for close elections that aren't slam dunks, where conversations like yours can make all the difference between winning and losing. I've got a lot more tips and strategies in my new book, The Joy of Talking Politics with Strangers: How to Save Democracy One Conversation at a Time. You can read an excerpt on my website, elizabethchur.com, where you can also buy the book and sign up for my free newsletter. I think somebody will be dropping the link in the chat. Thank you, Josie. And my website also has links to free videos of longer trainings I've done, including the full version of phone bank training for introverts and friends, You and the 34%, How to Have Meaningful Conversations with High Potential Voters, also known as people who rarely or never vote, and Spanish for Activists. And now I'm going to turn it back to Gabe. I think we're going to have time for a few questions and answers. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was awesome. If anyone wants to ask, I'm just gonna pick a few questions in the chat um, to ask Elizabeth. So if you have any questions for her, put it in the chat. And just a reminder to everyone, we are a nonpartisan organization, Center for Common Ground. So our mission is to fight voter suppression within communities that have been historically targeted by this. And so we won't be talking about parties or candidates, but we can talk about issues and voting rights. Yeah, actually, that's a great question from Sarah Watson. I've definitely gotten that question a lot. Is there a risk to alienating people who are getting many calls from different organizations?
Well, it sounds like I think Andrea could probably weigh on this better or anybody on the team, but it sounds like these are folks that actually aren't getting many calls from folks. Is that right?
Yeah,
That's correct. We're calling rural North Carolina.
right. And let's see, some of these are questions. Oh, how do callers stay positive when most people hang up? That's a good question for you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think again, for me, setting realistic expectations that, you probably will experience a few hang-ups, but if you could maybe just connect with one or two voters during your shift, and if you keep making calls, you'll probably be able to keep some folks on the line. Um, those one or two votes could make the difference in some of these elections, including for like state legislative races, which are often decided by like half a dozen votes. And, hopefully this won't be your only shift. Hopefully you'll be able to volunteer some more between now and election day. And look at all the people on this call. If every single person on this call today connected with two voters during your shift, that is over 500 votes. Can you imagine that? I mean, these are races that are razor thin. So I guess I would just encourage you, yes, sometimes it stings a little bit when people hang up, but it's for me, it's all worth it to have one or two good connections with a voter.
Great. We have a lot of questions about what happens if someone asks or says partisan stuff. And just as a Center for Common Ground rep, I'll just say like we just kind of smile and say we're nonpartisan. But if there's any, if people are maybe particularly argumentative about anything, Elizabeth, I'm wondering if you have some words of wisdom for that.
Argumentative in terms of,
Maybe they're very partisan and they, they're not necessarily interested in initially listening to what you have to say.
well, I'll just say on the rare, I've actually, it's 100 times more likely in my experience to encounter someone that says I don't vote than someone that's hostile. And particularly for this audience of voters, it sounds like just culturally in general, people are more courteous than your average phone bank. But let's say that they're maybe a little bristly, but they're not actually overtly hostile. If they're hostile, I would just thank them for their time and hang up, because
Totally.
nobody deserves to be spoken like that, and there's no reason that you should be. But if they're just kind of grumpy, but they're cordial but grumpy, I would just ask them, tell me more about what you care about. Or one of the questions I mentioned before, what if you were in charge of the country, what 2 or 3 things would you change? How would you make our country better? Ask some questions to get them talking. People are often flattered that you care enough that you'd want to hear their opinion, and that you're going to stick around and listen to the answer. And when they do bring stuff up, you can ask some follow-up questions. Well, how would that make your life better? Or how do you envision that happening? Just get them to talk more, I think. And I often feel like once people are heard, they kind of simmer down a little bit, because they feel like they're being seen and heard, and they don't have to keep saying it over and over, because you're expressing that you are understanding and recognizing their concerns.
That's so true. And I think it's also true in real life. If you're having a real life conflict with someone, just asking them about how they feel about it can really just crack it all open.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Maybe if Josie, if you could put that link once more in the chat to Elizabeth's website. There's a whole book about this now that exists that you can get. So yeah, we're really grateful.